Joseph James DeAngelo is one of the most chilling figures in American history, having committed numerous rapes and murders. In the previous video, we talked about his early minor offenses. Today, we're delving into his more significant crimes and revealing some of his real voice, which was recorded by one of the victims back in 1977. Between 1976 and 1979, there was a surge in crime across the United States. During this time, various types of sexual assaults and serial murders occurred at an alarming rate, largely due to the Golden State Killer. He was known as the East Area Rapist or Original Night Stalker at the time, but no one knew that these two are the same individual. Depending on the sources, he committed around 50 sexual assaults during this period. These assaults began in June 1976 and continued until July 1979, averaging roughly 1 to 2 assaults per month. Sometimes, he even committed multiple assaults in a single day or up to 5 in a month. Initially, he focused on the eastern part of Sacramento. He targeted homes where women were alone, displaying an extensive knowledge of his victims. He often waited for the moment when husbands left for work and then intruded into the homes. During the assaults, he would sometimes reference the husbands or discuss their occupations, asserting control over his victims. Around April 1977, the criminal became even bolder, breaking into homes when entire families were asleep, rather than targeting homes with only women present. Interviews with victims revealed the horrifying nature of his crimes. Victims would be in their beds when they heard someone calling. They would be shocked to see a man standing at the end of their beds, his face hidden. The victims were terrified, but the criminal would threaten them with a gun, forcing the woman to tie up her husband or partner. Once the men were immobilized, the Golden State Killer would place an object on their back and threaten to kill the woman if they dropped it. Then, he would take the woman to another room and commit his crimes. Helplessly, the men had to listen to the sounds during these assaults, which could last for hours. He even committed assaults in homes where children were sleeping. After the rape, the perpetrator would threaten the victim, warning that any movement would result in their death. He would then freely roam around the house, sometimes helping himself to food and beer. Later, he'd return to the victim and commit the rape again. This disturbing pattern repeated, and in some instances, he subjected the victim to more than 5 rapes while staying in their home. What's even more horrifying is the uncertainty of when this torment would finally end. During the crime, the victim's eyes were covered, so they could only rely on sounds to understand what was happening. Yet, in some cases, after several rapes, when the perpetrator's voice or movement was no longer heard, the victim might think he had left. But if they dared to move, the perpetrator would suddenly take out a knife and say,
"I told you not to move. If you move again, you'll die."
The victim had no way of knowing how much time had passed before they could move, but it's clear that the perpetrator watched them for at least several minutes, if not longer. It's almost unimaginable how someone could do such things. After enduring such an ordeal, victims were often left terrified, unable to make a sound even when they didn't hear anything from the perpetrator. The fear that he might still be watching would paralyze them for hours. Only after some unknown time had passed, sometimes not until dawn, would they find the courage to move and report the crime to the police. As mentioned earlier, male victims who were tied up during the crime had to listen to their partners or girlfriends suffering throughout the ordeal. While it might not be the same as the direct suffering of female victims, the pain endured by male victims should not be dismissed. They probably would have lived with the anguish of not being able to protect their wives or girlfriends. During the 3-year period, there were almost 50 cases of serial rape in the Sacramento and San Francisco East Bay area. However, at that time, the police were primarily focused on keeping these cases secret, fearing that it might lead to imitators or copycat criminals. But if the public had been made aware of the perpetrator's methods, it could have potentially reduced the number of victims. This is because, similar to the burglaries he committed in Visalia, he had some distinctive behaviors. For example, he would break into unoccupied homes before the actual crimes to learn about the residents and the layout of the house. He would also repeatedly make silent phone calls to determine when someone was at home, among other actions. So, If this information had been shared with the public, it might have helped prevent many victims. Another significant problem was the total lack of cooperation between the various local police departments. Despite the obvious pattern indicating that these were the acts of the same perpetrator occurring in different areas, each police department was more concerned with keeping everything under wraps. When the crimes shifted from the Sacramento region to the San Francisco East Bay Area, police higher-up simply dismissed it as someone else's problem. However, the actual investigators working on the case put in more effort than anyone else. If it weren't for their dedication during that time, they might have never caught the criminal. A few investigators, who couldn't forget about this case, worked tirelessly to ensure that the case records and evidence weren't destroyed for over 30 years, possibly preserving the perpetrator's DNA. Before committing the crimes, the perpetrator would often make several silent calls to check if anyone was home. Even after the crimes, there were instances where he would contact the victims again, and some of these phone calls actually captured the perpetrator's voice. This particular call took place roughly a year and a half after the initial crime in 1976. The victim had installed a recording device after the crime, and one day, when she received the silent phone call, she immediately began recording, suspecting it was the criminal on the other end. With no sound coming from the caller, she simply placed the phone on the table and waited until the call ended before reporting it to the police. When she played the recording back for the police at her home, she was shocked to recognize the voice of the criminal. Here is a partial transcript of that phone call.
Hello? Hello?
In 2016, following the arrest of the perpetrator, Joseph DeAngelo, it came to light that he had worked as a police officer from 1973 to 1976 in the vicinity of Visalia. From 1976 to 1979, he was employed as a police officer in Auburn, which is located about 30 to 40 minutes east of Sacramento. This timeframe aligns with the period when burglaries occurred in Visalia from 1973 to 1975, followed by the onset of rape incidents in the Sacramento area in 1976. It's noteworthy that until his arrest, many people suspected that the suspect might be a police officer or connected to the military due to the precision and discipline observed in his actions. One reason for these suspicions was his apparent deliberate avoidance of areas with a strong police presence, as if he had inside information. Finally, it's important to mention that the statute of limitations for rape during that time was only 3 years. As a result, even in the initial cases, the statute of limitations had already expired before he completed his series of crimes. Consequently, the prosecution could only charge him with kidnapping for 16 of the cases in which he took victims to different locations, in addition to the 13 murder charges, which were not subject to the statute of limitations. Finally, he was found guilty and received a death sentence, but through a plea deal, he was spared from the death penalty. In our next video, we'll explore the incredible transformation of the Golden State Killer from a rapist into a serial killer. Be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching.